Hello, welcome to my presentation Language, Nationhood and Education, Post-Soviet and Post-Colonial Perspectives, presented by Ludmilla Beckett, University of the Free States, South Africa. In the light of the recent events in the Council of Europe, which expressed concerns regarding the Ukrainian education law, I would like to discuss language planning activities and language policy in countries which gained independence relatively recently. I would like to run an overview of different approaches which have been taken in the field of national education to strengthen the national consolidation. I would also like to show setbacks and problems with chosen language strategies in these countries. I would also like to show erroneous assumptions which are commonly present in public minds when it comes to speculations about the nature of relations between the language and the nation. In this presentation, I will show how different post-colonial countries built their models of the national education. First of all, it is interesting to show common folk expectations in relation to functions of language or languages in the society. For instance, what are relations between multiple languages in multi-ethnic society? What sorts of linguistic planning helps to preserve national unity? How many languages can be accepted as subject medium in educational institutions? Such sets of beliefs and expectations are called the language ideology and have been analyzed in the volume edited by the Belgian scholar Jan Blommert. Among the patterns analyzed by Blommert and his contributors, there is a distinctive thread of purist expectations and beliefs. Among them, there can be found the belief that language is a marker of identity and a unifying force which brings together people residing in neighboring lands. I'd like to give an example from my scholarly encounters in validating this assumption. In a recent conference on language policy in China, an invited speaker introduced himself. My mother tongue is Swedish, but I have a very strong Finnish identity. The offshoots of this assumption about language and identity marker are the beliefs that the ideal model of the society is monolingual, monoethnic, monoreligious, and monoideological. As Belgian scholars Blommert and Verschueren demonstrated that this puristic belief goes hand in hand with another judgment. Plurilingual societies are perceived as unstable and prone to dissolution because each language in the multilingual country can be a stimulus either to form an independent nation or to unite with a kin state. However, this assertion also can be countered by multiple examples. Other Belgian scholars, Pullings and Avermaet, focus on assumption that its unwillingness or refusal to learn and use the state language is a sign of disloyalty. However, multiple examples can be given to demonstrate that the inability to speak the national language by some groups in the society does not represent a threat to the nation on its own. The purist language ideology demands that the nation should be represented by the sole language and gives rise to the motto, "One nation, one language." Then, if we ask ourselves what is nation, the answer can be prompted in the style of former President Yushchenko. It is a community of people united through a common language, common religion, common traditions and history. But is this a true representation of the nation and forces behind its formation? In 1882, a French scholar, Ernst Renan, gave a different answer to the question, what is nation? In disputes between France and Germany regarding the status of the disputed territory of Alsace in Lorraine, where a German dialect was spoken, but people's allegiances were with France, the answer for the question, what is the nation, was, nation is a willingness of people to live together. The modern series of nationhood starts from the premises outlined by Ernst Renan. For instance, they stipulate that nation is also a collection of shared memories and shared forgettings. Neither it's possible to claim that the national language is always a unifying force. For instance, the number of Italians who spoke of national language, which is Florentino, a Tuscan dialect, was estimated to be between 2.5 to 12% of the population of the peninsula. As I further show, the independence in Indonesia was proclaimed in Dutch, and later the nation adopted the Malay language, which was the language of the minority, represented only 5% of the population. Hence, I provide 3 different case studies, which outline different directions in language planning, national education, and patterns of plurilingualism. We have to look at what sort of language-related problems arise in multilingual societies, how young nations organize their systems of education. We'll consider 3 case studies, and the first one is the situation in the Republic of South Africa, which gained independence in 1961, Malaysia, which gained independence in 1957, Indonesia, which proclaimed independence in 1945 after the capitulation of Japan in the Second World War, but was fully recognized as an independent country in the 1960s. South Africa became a self-governing entity under the Union of South Africa Act in 1909. The Union itself was established in 1910. And then it still formed a part of the British Commonwealth. The independence of the Republic of South Africa came on the 31st of May in 1961. The language front in South Africa was mainly marked by the struggle between 2 colonial languages, English and Dutch, and further English and Afrikaans. The compromise between the 2 conflicting linguistic choices was reached when 9 African languages were included in the founding portion of the Constitution adopted in 1996. This slide will show us the distribution of languages commonly spoken in South Africa. For Zulu, it's 24% of the population, then Xhosa, 18%, Afrikaans, 13%, different varieties of Sesotho, 9% and 8% of two different varieties. English 8%, Setswana 8%, and then small groups of Tsonga 5%, Sitswati 3%, Venda 2%, Ndebele 2%, and others 1%. And what can we see if we look at the language legislation in South Africa? Multilingualism was chosen as an anti-racism tool to promote reconciliation. And you can look at the section 6, subsection 1 constitution adopted in 1996. It's interesting to note that the 9 African languages had practical regional status in the homelands before. The trilingual requirement of the Use of Official Languages Act, Republic of South Africa, adopted in 2012, is an attempt to curb the negative effect of the 50-50 egalitarian arrangements. From 1910 it was a distribution between Dutch and English, and from 1925 to 1993 it was a 50-50 distribution between Afrikaans and English. And Afrikaans is daughter language of Dutch, and it's also a Creole language because it has a lot of intakes from other languages like Malay and other exotic languages. The official language ideology can be defined as follows. All official languages should enjoy parity of esteem and be treated equitably. And how can we describe the education in South Africa? The education in South Africa is basically bilingual or trilingual. Only official languages may be used for instructions. From grade 3 onwards, all pupils will have to study the language they are taught in and at least one other approved language. Governing bodies must stipulate how their schools will promote multilingualism, bilingualism or trilingual education. The right to choose the language of learning and teaching is vested with the individual. The right has, however, to be exercised within the overall framework of the obligation on the education system to promote multilingualism. Where a certain language is not available, learners may request the provincial education department to make provision for instruction in the chosen language. And what are challenges and setbacks of the Use of Official Languages Act? By not clearly determining which languages to use in specific offices and territories, this new arrangement remains essentially egalitarian and thereby opening the door for English to strengthen its position as default language. The Parliament and executive authorities failed to translate and publish all national legislation into 11 official languages. The realization of the fact led to the continuous litigation, Cornelius Lawrence versus the Presidents of the Republic of South Africa. And the outcome of this litigation is still unknown. So that's a joke about South Africans. They think about themselves in one language, correct themselves in another, and finally express themselves in a third language. Malaysia, formerly known as Malaya, is a post-colonial country which gained independence from the British government in 1957. Later Sabah and Sarawak, today known as East Malaysia, joined Malaya and the country became known as Malaysia. Article 3 and 152 of the Malaysian Federal Constitution, adopted in 1957, define Malaysia as Islamic, whereby national linguistic unity will be achieved with Bahasa Malaysia, the Malay language, as the official language for government and public officers. And here we can see the map of Malaysia and the states which constitutes Malaysia. It's hard to provide a visual for distribution of languages in Malaysia. The Ethnologue.com lists 137 languages for this country. The official language ideology is asserting ethno-linguistic dominance of Malay people. The most spoken languages are Bahasa Melayu or Bahasa Malaysia official, around 60–70% of the population. English, some sources present English as the second most popular language, while others claim that a variety of Chinese dialects are the second largest linguistic group, over 20% of the population. It followed by Tamil, around 7%, and speakers of indigenous languages, around 11% of population. Oban and Kedazan are the most popular indigenous languages. And what is the education like in Malaysia? While English government schools, a legacy of the British colonial government, were eliminated over time, Mandarin and Tamil medium primary schools were provided for Chinese and Indian population. Malay is the medium of instructions both in primary and secondary government schools. Children graduated from primary vernacular schools move on to the secondary government schools where Malay is the medium of instructions. To obtain proficiency in the Malay language, these children have to undergo an extra year of Malay language schooling in what came to be known as remove class. And what are challenges and setbacks in Malaysian education? The Education Act of 1995 allowed the establishment of private universities, where English is the medium of instruction. What has resulted is that there is now further division in choice of language for Malaysians. 95% of Malaysian Chinese and 55% of Malaysian Indians attend vernacular primary schools. If their parents can afford, they attend private secondary schools where English is mainly used. Then they moved on to private universities where English is the medium of instruction. It has been reported that ethnic polarization has increased, and this could partly be due to early segregation whilst in primary schools. There has been a provision for pupils' own language, or POL. This is made possible if a group of 15 students requests to be taught their own language as a subject. This requirement has often not been found to be realistically possible. A lack of trained teachers in minority and indigenous languages has been reported. What has happened in Malaysia is that children of different ethnic groups tend to attend different school systems. The divide is not only ethnic, but income-based. Trends in mass media also do not help much to eliminate the ethnic division in Malaysia. The Malaysian TV channels and press remain unpopular among other ethnic groups. Paula Kalutzi argues, it would suffice to watch television and see the most programs in Malay only feature Malay actors' guests and make frequent reference to their religion. The programs where the different ethnic groups interact, not so many actually, being mostly in English. Even the widely circulated newspapers in Malay, such as the Tusan Malaysia, are strongly nationalistic, sometimes with racist overtones. And what is happening in the Malaysian system of education? English is slowly creeping back. And this does not necessarily mean that it's always a bad thing. English can be used as an unofficial official language. In the states of Sabah and Sarawak, English is an official language. In Malaysia, the national language has had to compete with English and other local languages, which are used as the language of intra- and inter-ethnic communication and between diverse ethnic groups. The choice of English as lingua franca appears to offer more benefits than Malaysian, as it is the language of the commercial sector. English is also a global lingua franca and does not strengthen the power of any local ethnicity. The affirmative action strengthening the status of Bahasa Malaysia also has to be entwined with attempts to revive indigenous languages. And now we are moving to our last case study, Indonesia. Indonesia proclaimed independence in 1945 following the capitulation of Japan. The Dutch officially recognized the Indonesian independence following the 1962 New York Agreement and the UN-mandated Act of Free Choice in 1969. Indonesia is the fourth most populous nation in the world, with an estimated population of nearly 250 million. It consists of over 13,000 islands, stretching along the equator between Southeast Asia and Australia. There are a significant number of distinct ethnic groups, speaking in more than 600 languages. The size and diversity of Indonesia's population has presented challenges for uniting the nation and developing a national language. Here we can see the map of Indonesia, its provinces and islands, and two boys in national Balinese costumes. Indonesia's national language policy has been called a miraculous success, and perhaps even the most spectacular linguistic phenomenon of our age. As the Netherlands East Indies, the islands of Indonesia had been arbitrarily united by colonial power, and there was no history of unity as a nation to help settle the national language question. There were three languages which emerged as possible official languages for the new nation, which would be created from the Netherlands Indies: the colonial language Dutch, the language of the largest ethnic group Javanese, and the historic lingua franca of the archipelago, Malay. We consider advantages and disadvantages among three prospective national languages for Indonesia, and we'll start with the colonial language Dutch. Dutch, as the colonial language, was spoken by the educated elite of Indonesia, and as such was the language that the future leaders of the nation felt most comfortable speaking and writing. It was a developed and standardized modern language with an extensive literature and text in all fields of study. It was also the language of the existing legal system and government administration in the Netherlands East Indies. As an international language, Dutch did not have the same stature as other colonial languages, such as English and French. It was reported that Indonesia found it easier to dispel Dutch than India or Malaysia to dispel English. We move now to the language of the majority group in Indonesia, the Javanese language. At the time of Indonesia's independence, the Javanese made up to almost 48% of Indonesia's population. They were by far the largest ethnic group and made up a significant proportion of the educated elite. Javanese was a written language with a rich literary tradition. If the majority Javanese were to impose their language on the rest of the population, then it could evoke a high level of resentment for their perceived dominance in the political and economic domains. It has often been said, mainly by the Javanese of a later day, that the adoption of Indonesian as the national language was a magnanimous concession on the part of the Javanese near majority. And now we consider a paradox. The Malay language, which has become the national language of Indonesia. The Malay language was a native language of less than 5% of the population at the time of independence. Although the language had relatively few speakers, it served as a lingua franca in much of the archipelago over 1,000 years. In contrast to Javanese, Malay was regarded as easy to learn. The language had spread as a lingua franca through historical empires in the western part of the archipelago, through trade throughout the archipelago, and as a vehicle for the propagation of the Islamic religion and later the Christian religion in the eastern islands. Malay was the native language of a small group, as well as a group that didn't have any power in the society. It was not regarded as a threat to the identity of other ethnic groups, in the way that Javanese might have been seen. The potential danger of ethnic divisions and conflicts occurring in such large a diverse nation made it essential to bring the nation together through a shared sense of nationhood, and the Indonesian language was both the symbol and the vehicle of that unity. What is the secret of success of Malay, which became the national language of Indonesia? There is a list of factors which contributed to its success. The ethnically neutral status of Malay in not being the first language of any prominent ethnic group. An easy syntactic and morphological structure, which is not the case with Javanese. Very unnativeness of Malay has been the key to the success of the Indonesian language development. Urban communities and increasing urbanization bring together Indonesians of different ethnic groups. The urbanization has provided a setting which requires the use of a language of wider communication, a need which is filled by Indonesian. How does the adoption of the Malay language affect the education in Indonesia? In 1930, under the Dutch colonial administration, only 31% of the population over age 10 was literate. By 1996, after 51 years of independence, 87% of the population was literate in Indonesian. Indonesian is the language of instruction from primary school through university throughout the nation, although vernacular languages are optionally allowed in the first 3 years of primary school in 9 regions of the country. Islamic universities offer education in Arabic, and 20 Dutch universities offer intake for Indonesians. Setbacks in the tertiary education in Indonesia. An insufficient number of university-level texts have been translated into Indonesian, and most university texts used continue to be in English and Dutch, even now, more than 60 years after independence. Very few books have been published in the decades after independence, especially those books which represent the basic characteristics of modern cultural values, science, economics, and technology. It contributes to the deterioration of academic and intellectual life in Indonesia at the present. This lack will prove detrimental to the progress of the Indonesian people in the modern world. The Indonesian Higher Education Ministry has released a plan to make English interaction amongst university students compulsory. However, it's not evident how it is going to happen. Now we come to our conclusions. The overview of linguistic developments in the three post-colonial countries demonstrates that false beliefs about the supremacy of the language of the major ethnic group on the national scene can be misleading. Different young nations opt for different schemes in their language planning. The nation is not always glued by a single language in common use. Languages of inter-ethnic communication retain their importance. Both local and global lingua franca cannot be easily discarded. Sometimes it's easier to build on the popularity of the existing lingua franca and to maintain the health of indigenous languages than to fight against the tidal waves. As Ernst Renan pointed out in the 19th century, that the nationhood is based on the willingness of the people to live together, rather than on commonalities of languages they speak. Testing the endurance of this willingness by radical changes in any sphere of public life can weaken the nation. Activities for elevating the status of the national language should include not only sticks but carrots as well. Now we can summarize setbacks in national education of these three countries. In many countries there are shortages of teachers of indigenous languages and teachers capable delivering subjects in indigenous languages. Shortages of professional teachers of foreign languages are also very common. Scholarly literature in the national language is not always synchronized with the latest development in sciences. English presents both challenges and opportunities for the education in countries without a long history of statehood. Problems with education do not always relate to languages of education, but to opportunities available to rich and poor families. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.